There was a kitchen. There is always a kitchen. A screen door, a coffee can on the back of the stove, a woman who never once measured anything and never once got it wrong. What she made in that kitchen was not poverty food. It was engineering, chemistry, economics, worked out in cast iron, one Sunday at a time. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. None of it was an accident. 25 tricks. She never wrote a single one down. She didn't need to. Number 25. Bacon grease jar. A coffee can sat on the back burner in kitchens from the Carolina Low Country to the Mississippi Delta all through the 1930s, and it was never empty for long. Every strip of bacon, every piece of fatback left something behind, and that something got poured hot and gold into the can and saved. Cornbread got fried in it. Greens got seasoned with a spoonful. Eggs slid across a skillet slicked with last Tuesday's ham. Grandma just called it not letting good fat go to waste. Today, a jar of rendered duck fat sells for $14 at a gourmet market. She kept hers in a Folgers can for free. Number 24. Rice water. In the Low Country, where Gullah Geechee families had cooked rice for generations, the cloudy water left behind after boiling it was never dumped down the drain. It went into gravies. It went into the washpot to stiffen collars and cuffs. By the 1920s and 30s, that starchy water was doing double duty in kitchens that couldn't afford to let anything, liquid or otherwise, go to waste twice. Number 23. Ash cakes. Before there was always a stove, there were coals. In sharecropper cabins across rural Georgia and Alabama in the 1930s, cornmeal batter went straight into the embers of the hearth, wrapped in a cabbage leaf or nothing at all, and baked by the fire itself. Cornmeal ran about 3 cents a pound. The heat was free. What came out was smoky, dense, and scraped clean of ash before it touched a single plate. Number 22. Watermelon rind pickles. Summer in the Mississippi Delta meant watermelon, and it meant the white rind left behind never once hit the trash. Sliced, brined in vinegar and sugar and clove, packed into jars through the 1930s and 40s, that rind became pickle to be eaten all winter. A specialty shop today will sell you a jar of pickled rind for $9 and call it artisanal. Number 21. Fried mush. Cornmeal mush, boiled soft the night before across Appalachian and rural southern kitchens in the 1930s, was never a one-night dish. Poured into a loaf pan, chilled overnight, it turned firm enough to slice by morning. Fried in a hot skillet until the edges went dark and crisp, it became an entirely different meal for the price of nothing extra at all. Number 20. Vinegar pie. There was no fruit in the house. There was flour, sugar, butter, and a jar of vinegar on the shelf, and that was enough. Across Depression-era Appalachia and the rural South in the 1930s, vinegar pie showed up on tables where a lemon simply wasn't coming, the acid standing in, the custard setting up golden and sharp underneath a crust rolled thin with lard. This was not a substitute dessert. This was defiance, baked at 350 degrees. Nobody at that table ever asked where the lemons went. They just asked for seconds. Number 19. Cracklins. Hog killing season came once a year, in the cold months, on farms across the rural South through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And every piece of that animal had somewhere to go. The skin, cut into strips and rendered down in its own fat until it puffed and crisped and turned the color of a good tan, became cracklins, salty, shattering, eaten straight from the pan, or worked into the next batch of cornbread. Today, a bag of pork rinds runs $4 or $5 at a gas station checkout, sealed in plastic, seasoned with something out of a lab. It is not the same. It was never going to be the same. Number 18. The chitlins cleaning ritual. Hog killing day meant chitlins, and chitlins meant hours, not minutes, hours of washing. Vinegar and lemon, cold water run, again and again, a Sunday's worth of patience spent on a Tuesday in kitchens across the rural South through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Nobody rushed it, nobody complained about it out loud. The labor itself was a kind of respect for the animal, for the family waiting to eat, for a grandmother who understood that some love takes all day to cook. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1911, a company called Procter & Gamble launched a new product made from cottonseed oil and called it Crisco. They didn't just sell it, they gave away cookbooks full of recipes, mailed to homes and printed in newspapers that told American women lard and bacon grease were old-fashioned, messy, unscientific. A relic of a kitchen that hadn't caught up yet. It was a campaign built to make a woman feel embarrassed about the very same coffee can of rendered fat her own mother had kept on the stove. And it worked in 1,000 kitchens that traded a free resource for a can bought at the store. That is not progress. That is 100 years of women being told their grandmother's knowledge was something to be ashamed of. It wasn't ever true. The fat was fine. It always was. Number 17. Neck bones and pig feet gravy. After the Great Migration carried families north into Chicago and Detroit through the 1940s and 50s, the cuts that came cheapest at the butcher counter, neck bones, pig's feet, the parts a lot of customers walked right past, became the backbone of a whole pot. Simmered for hours until the meat gave up and the broth turned rich and cloudy, those bones built a gravy that fed a family for pennies a serving in a northern city that had never once asked what she was working with. Number 16. Smokehouse curing. Refrigeration wasn't reliable, and often wasn't there at all, on rural southern farms, through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So meat got salted, packed and hung in a smokehouse over a slow-burning fire until it could survive a whole winter without spoiling. This wasn't guesswork. Salt draws out moisture, and moisture is what bacteria need to live. Smoke adds a chemical layer of preservation on top of that. She never called it food science. It was food science all the same. Number 15. Red-eye gravy. Whatever coffee was left in the pot from breakfast, in kitchens across Appalachia and the rural South through the 1930s, didn't get poured out. It got poured straight into the hot skillet where a slice of country ham had just come out, deglazing the drippings into a thin, dark, bittersweet gravy named for the ring of fat that floated on top like an eye staring back up at you. Number 14. Smothered steak. A tough, cheap cut of beef in working-class Southern kitchens and the migration-era north through the 1940s wasn't sent back to the butcher. It was pounded thin, dredged in flour, browned hard in a skillet, then buried under a blanket of pan gravy and left to simmer low until the toughness had nowhere left to go. What came out an hour later had no business being that tender for the price that had been paid. Number 13. Hoppin' John. On New Year's Day, in the South Carolina Lowcountry, from before the turn of the 20th century, clear through the 1950s, black-eyed peas and rice shared a pot for luck and for economy in equal measure. A little meat went a long way when it was cooked down into rice built to feed a whole table. Grandma just called it doing right by the new year and doing right by whoever was hungry at that table, meat or no meat. Number 12. Kitchen pepper. Long before anyone bottled a seasoning blend and put a name on the tin, enslaved cooks along the southern coast were seasoning shellfish and greens with a peppery, salty mix carried over from West African foodways, a tradition that reached back generations before a single commercial spice company ever existed. They knew things about seasoning that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, dressed up now in tins that never once mention where the flavor started. Number 11. Pot liquor and cornbread. The pot was never empty. Collard greens cooked down for 2 hours with a piece of fatback in kitchens across the rural South and the Appalachian coal fields through the 1930s, And what was left in the bottom wasn't broth anymore. It was darker than that, silkier, the color of strong tea left too long on the stove. It got ladled over crumbled cornbread and eaten without a second thought. George Washington Carver's nutrition research out of Tuskegee in the very same decade documented what she already knew standing at that stove. The vitamins the greens gave up in cooking iron, calcium, folate, ended up right there in the liquid. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 10. Eggshells in coffee and stock. Nothing got thrown out whole if it could be used broken. In rural kitchens across the South through the 1930s and 40s, a cracked eggshell dropped into a simmering pot of coffee grounds or a stock pot helped settle the grit and cut the bitterness, clarifying what would otherwise come out cloudy. A trick with no name in any cookbook, passed along because it worked. Number 9. Buttermilk soak for fried chicken. Before the flour, before the hot oil, there was a bowl of buttermilk on Southern farm kitchen counters through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and the chicken sat in it for hours. The acid worked the meat tender from the inside, while the tang built a flavor no amount of seasoning could fake from the outside alone. A restaurant today will put buttermilk brined fried chicken on a menu for $22 a plate and call it a discovery. Here's the part nobody puts on the menu. For decades, the same dishes built in kitchens like these dishes, born out of what a family could afford and nothing more, were mocked as poor food, country food, something to be embarrassed by outside the family. And then, slowly, the very same dishes started showing up on white tablecloths under new names, charged at triple and quadruple the price, while the families who built that knowledge over 100 years of practice were too often locked out of the capital, the loans, and the ownership it took to open the restaurant themselves. That is not discovery. That is 100 years of labor with somebody else's name on the check. The dish didn't change. Who got paid for it did. Number 8. Candied yams with molasses. Sugar cost money. And during the Depression, and again during wartime rationing in the 1940s, money was the one ingredient a rural Southern kitchen didn't have extra of. Molasses did the job instead. Dark, thick, cheaper by the jar, poured over sliced sweet potatoes, and baked low and slow until they turned glossy and deep amber, the kitchen filling with a smell like burnt sugar and wood smoke at once. Nobody at that table ever asked if it was the real recipe. It was the only recipe there was money for, and it was better for it. Number 7. Oxtail braising. Butchers in New York and Chicago during the Great Migration years of the 1940s through the 60s sold oxtail cheap because most customers didn't want it too much bone, too much connective tissue, too much work. That work was exactly the point. Browned hard, then braised low for hours until the collagen broke down into something rich and gelatinous. Oxtail became a Sunday centerpiece built from what everyone else had walked past. Grocery stores today price oxtail at $9 to $12 a pound and market it as a delicacy. It was always a delicacy. It just used to be an affordable one. Number 6. Fish and spaghetti. At church suppers in black communities around Washington, D.C., through the 1950s and 60s, a fry of catfish or whiting didn't have to feed everyone on its own. Laid over a bed of buttered spaghetti, doused in the same hot sauce sitting on every table in the fellowship hall, one pan of fish stretched into a full plate for a whole congregation without anybody going home hungry. Number 3. Cooking by feel, not measuring cups. In the South Carolina Low Country, Gullah cooks measured in handfuls and pinches, and the sound a pot made when it was ready, not in cups and teaspoons. Berta Mae Grosvenor put a name to it in 1970 Vibration Cooking. She called it cooking by instinct instead of by instruction, a way of knowing that lived in the hands before it ever lived on a page. Number 2. The all-day Sunday pot. After church let out, a pot that had been simmering low since before sunrise was waiting at home, in kitchens across the South for generations, and nobody rushed it to the table. That pot taught patience the way nothing else in the week could, the understanding that some things simply cannot be hurried into being good. Number 1. Collard greens with ham hock. Number 1. The greens. Washed leaf by leaf, cooked down for hours with a ham hock in a pot big enough to feed whoever showed up, in kitchens across the entire South for longer than almost anyone alive can remember. Nothing about that pot was wasted, not the pot liquor, not the hock, not a single leaf. This was not a side dish. This was the whole philosophy of that kitchen, boiled down into one pot. A trendy restaurant today will plate a small dish of braised greens for $14. She fed a family of 6 on the same greens for less than that, and there was always enough for whoever knocked on the door. Closing. The bacon grease jar. The cast iron, seasoned black by hand. The pot of greens that never once ran out before everyone at the table was full. None of it was an accident, and none of it was poverty. It was 25 different answers to the same hard question, worked out over decades in kitchens the world spent too long looking down on. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They didn't invent nose-to-tail cooking or zero-waste kitchens or slow-braised anything. She invented it first, out of necessity, and did it better. That is not a trend. That is a century of knowledge this country tried very hard to make people forget. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. Number 13. Jambalaya, rice cooked down in a pot with sausage, chicken, and whatever shellfish the day's catch brought in, all of it simmered together until the rice went dark and sticky with the fat and spice of everything around it. 15 cents a bowl, and in New Orleans, one pot could feed a packed back room without anyone having to wait. This was efficiency wearing a Creole accent. A speakeasy running a full house didn't have time for individual orders. It needed one large pot that kept refilling itself all night. Fast enough that nobody noticed the wait. Hot enough that nobody complained about it. This was not a delicacy. This was crowd math, simmered for hours. Number 12. Codfish cakes, salted cod, soaked for a day to pull the salt back out, shredded fine and mixed with mashed potato, formed into small cakes and fried until the outside crackled. 8 cents. Cheap because salt cod had been cheap in New England fishing towns for over a century. The same boats that ran rum down from Canada into Massachusetts harbors had been hauling salt cod for generations before Prohibition ever started. Nothing about the supply chain changed. Only the cargo got more interesting. Codfish cakes fed the fishing town speakeasies because the fish was already there, already cheap, already part of a smuggling route that had simply added a second product. Nothing wasted. Not the fish, not the boats. Number 11. Waldorf salad. Crisp apple cut small, celery sliced thin, walnuts broken rough, all of it bound together in mayonnaise gone pale and sweet, served cold in a small glass dish like something out of a hotel dining room, because it was. 20 cents, served in the hotel speakeasies that traced their lineage straight back to the Waldorf Astoria's own kitchens. This dish did something almost nobody else on the menu did. It looked wholesome. Fruit, nuts, a light dressing. Served at a table where a man might also be ordering bootleg gin, the Waldorf salad gave the whole meal a veneer of respectability, proof, on paper, that this was simply dinner. This was not a salad. This was a costume the rest of the meal wore. Number 10. Chili con carne. Beef simmered for hours with dried chiles, cumin, and beans, cooked down until the sauce went thick enough to coat a spoon and hold there. 10 cents a bowl, served hot along the Texas border and through the smuggling towns that ran liquor north out of Mexico, the same way other routes ran it south out of Canada. Chili fed both sides of the operation, the men loading trucks at the border and the men unloading them hours later, miles up the road, in rooms that all served some version of the same bowl. It was cheap, it reheated without losing anything. and it asked nothing of a kitchen that might need to disappear by morning. That is not a regional specialty. That is fuel for a supply chain. Number 9. Pickled pig's feet. Pig's feet boiled until the meat went soft and gelatinous, then packed into jars of vinegar brine with a little spice, left to sit until the texture turned cool and almost translucent. 5 cents, the cheapest item on almost every speakeasy menu in the South and through Appalachia. Even in rooms swimming in bootleg cash, even with bankers and bootleggers both drinking out of the same backroom glasses, somebody was still ordering the pig's feet. Old habits don't disappear just because the money showed up. The cooks who'd grown up wasting nothing kept making the dish that wasted nothing, whether or not anyone in the room still needed to save a nickel. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Even when nobody around her needed it to be anymore. There's a piece of this nobody talks about, and it has nothing to do with crime. It has to do with chemistry. Bartenders in the 1920s, most of them running these kitchens too, understood something that wouldn't be formally studied for decades. Salty, fatty food slows the absorption of alcohol into the bloodstream. A man who ate deviled eggs and pickled pig's feet and salt pork beans could drink for hours without falling apart, without getting sick, without becoming a liability the bar had to drag out the back door. This wasn't an accident. It was a documented tactic, repeated room after room, city after city. Keep the food cheap, keep it fatty, keep it coming, and the customer stays upright, stays buying, stays exactly long enough to spend everything in his pocket. Modern bars still do this. They just don't have to hide the liquor to get away with it anymore. That is not hospitality. That is a science experiment run on paying customers for 13 straight years, and almost nobody ever wrote it down. Number 8. French onion soup. Onions sliced thin and cooked down low for hours until they went dark and sweet, drowned in beef broth, topped with a crust of bread and cheese melted hard under the broiler until it bubbled at the edges. 18 cents, simmered for most of a day in the back of French immigrant-run cellar clubs across New York. There is something almost defiant about a dish that takes 8 hours to make, served in a room built for transactions that needed to happen in under 8 minutes. French onion soup didn't care about the speed of the business around it. It simmered on its own schedule, in its own pot, while everything else in the building moved as fast as the law allowed it not to be caught. That is not a loss. That is the one thing in the building that refused to rush. Number 7. Eggs Benedict and English muffins split and toasted, topped with a slice of ham. An egg poached soft enough to break open on the first cut. All of it covered in a hollandaise sauce gone thick and pale yellow. 25 cents, served at hotel speakeasy brunches across New York in the late 1920s. Brunch itself was new in the 1920s, a meal invented almost entirely to give midday drinking somewhere respectable to happen. Nobody questioned a man ordering a mimosa at 11 in the morning if there was a plate of eggs in front of him. The meal was the alibi. The hollandaise was the cover story. This was not breakfast. This was the invention of an entire excuse. Number 6. Welsh rarebit, sharp cheddar melted slow with beer and a little mustard until it turned into a thick, pourable sauce, poured hot over toast until the bread went soft underneath and crisp at the edges. 15 cents, and in New York, the dish that let an entire speakeasy legally call itself a restaurant. Late-night supper laws in some cities required an establishment to actually serve food after a certain hour to keep operating at all. Welsh rarebit was fast, cheap, and technically a full meal: cheese, bread, and a sauce made partly with beer, which speakeasies could claim, with a straight face, was simply for flavor. This was not a snack. This was the fine print of the law, melted onto toast. Number 5. Lobster Newburg. Lobster meat folded into a sauce of cream, egg yolk, and a splash of sherry, cooked just until it thickened, served in a shallow dish with the lobster still glistening under the sauce. $1.25. More than most men in 1928 made in half a day's work, and exactly the point. High-end Manhattan speakeasies served lobster Newburg because bootleg money had nowhere else to go. You couldn't deposit it. You couldn't explain it. But you could spend it on a dollar lobster dish in a room nobody official was supposed to know existed, and feel, for 1 hour, like the money meant something. This was not dinner. This was a fortune eating itself in public. Number 4. Steak tartare, beef chopped raw and fine by hand, mixed cold with capers, onion, and a raw egg yolk on top, served with nothing cooked anywhere near it. 35 cents, served in the German-run cellar clubs of New York. There was a practical reason raw dishes showed up so often in speakeasy kitchens, beyond the taste. No cooking meant no smell drifting up through the floorboards, no smoke pulling attention from the street, no evidence of a kitchen running at hours a legal restaurant had no business being open. Steak tartare was silent food, served in a room that needed to stay that way. That is not a delicacy. That is a kitchen trying not to get caught. Number 3. Beef stroganoff. Strips of beef seared fast and hot, simmered briefly in a sauce of sour cream and mushroom until it went pale and rich, poured over egg noodles still steaming from the pot. 25 cents, served in the Russian Jewish immigrant speakeasies of the Lower East Side. On the menu, it was billed as continental cuisine, sophisticated, European, worth the price. In the kitchen, it was an immigrant recipe carried straight across an ocean, cooked the same way it had been cooked in homes that had nothing to do with Manhattan at all. The dish didn't change. Only the price tag and the accent it was sold under did. This was not fine French cooking. This was somebody's grandmother's recipe, wearing a different name to survive in a new country. Number 2. Oysters Rockefeller. Oysters on the half shell, topped with a green mixture of butter, herbs, and breadcrumbs, broiled until the top went dark and crisp, while the oyster underneath stayed cool and barely cooked. 40 cents a half dozen, roughly 10 times what oysters cost on an open-air stand just a few blocks away. In New Orleans, this was the dish a speakeasy used to justify everything else on the bill. A room could charge whatever it wanted for supper, if the supper looked expensive enough, and oysters dressed up under a broiler with butter and herbs looked like exactly the kind of meal that came with a cover charge attached. The oysters weren't really the product. The room was. The oysters just made it believable. That is not seafood. That is a price tag with a shell around it. Number 1. Rum cake, a dense, dark cake soaked through with actual rum, baked until the top went sticky and caramelized, served as dessert under the name fruit cake on menus that needed to look perfectly innocent if anyone ever asked to see one. 15 cents a slice, and the single boldest dish on this entire list. Here it is, the last item, and the one that says everything. Every other dish on this countdown hid the crime somewhere nearby. This one put it directly on the plate. A federal agent could have ordered a slice of fruit cake off a perfectly legal-looking menu and eaten Prohibition's exact violation without ever knowing it. That is not dessert. That is the entire 13 years of this era, baked into something sweet enough that nobody thought to ask what was really inside it. Closing 30 plates. 30 alibis. Men poached eggs and called it brunch so they could drink at noon. They simmered onions for 8 hours in a room built for 8-minute transactions because some things refused to rush even when everything around them did. They soaked a cake in rum and called it fruit cake and dared anyone to ask twice. None of this was an accident. The cooks behind these doors, most of them never named on a single ledger, never credited on a single menu, understood exactly what they were covering for, and they built food good enough to make federal agents forget to look closer. They were not garnish. They were the operation. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The modern restaurant, the modern brunch menu, the modern idea of a supper club, all of it was built in basements by people the law was actively hunting, and we never gave them credit for the invention. That is not prohibition. That is theft. Of names, of credit, of an entire era's worth of genius, hidden so well it took 100 years to even ask the question. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother or your grandfather, behind a bar he never talked about, actually made.